I honestly don't like the result of this for a lot of these questions, but there are still gems in my opinion. But what's new each quarter? You can definitely tell more people who recently found out about Palantir now, and it's reflected in the kinds of questions that we are seeing for the upcoming earnings. So we're almost at that time of the quarter, just a little over a week out until Q4 2024 earnings, which also would be for full year 2024. So stay tuned for that on Monday, February 3 after hours. But today, we're focused on the questions that are at the top of retail's mind, and I'm afraid to say the bar has been kind of falling in my opinion, but we still do get some interesting questions as noted that I'm personally curious about, but they don't seem to be anywhere near the top voted. So let's just get into them. The highest voted question at around 1,500, would there be a possible merger among Palantir, Anduril, and SpaceX to create one dominant entity to go after defense contracts? So first, I get why this is a top question. Lots of name and brand recognition, new administration, current events, and all that stuff. So it's definitely an attention grabber. And we even saw articles about a consortium to after defense contracts with names like these. There has already been murmurs about this, but nothing officially announced yet. Although merger is probably a bit deep for this and for any need for these companies. So I'm okay with this question if you've been following Palantir for a while. You know, this would most likely not be a merger, and I personally don't think it makes sense too, unless you're spinning off a very small specific part of Palantir to go off into the sunset for this specifically. But the need for a merger seems like overkill. If anything, I would expect an official partnership agreement or consortium, but even nothing officially, they could just still keep them as subcontractors depending on who wins the contract and, that kind of way of working. The main reason for consortium is that you are bidding on these contracts together and can therefore cover the best of each strengths in the bid versus a primary contractor kind of leading and relying on subcontractors. So maybe from the US government's perspective, they may see this as favorable if they're clearly working officially in partnership and fully understand each other's tasks and responsibilities under the contract that they're competing for. So we'll see if this gets addressed officially. Now, the second question with 1,300 votes and actually fifth too with around 628. I hate this question if you've been watching the channel, and even how it's asked is not useful in my opinion. Are there any plans in the near future of offering dividends to stockholders? First, we know Palantir is still in a growth phase and wants to portray that. So even if they wanted to give dividends, and they clearly could with their cash flow, it's literally a bad signal in my opinion, showing they don't know where to invest the cash for a better return. So it'd just be symbolic. Therefore, we'll just distribute it to you. The day they announce a dividend is the day they admit we've got a bit of cash more than we know what to deal with, which is good for stability and retirement, predictability in someone else's portfolio for cash flow. But we also know that would be a different era. Now, the question is just too general as well. Are there any plans in the near future? Basically, management can say yes. When the time is right and positioning of the company, that could be decades from now, 5 years, but still not a useful question at all and doesn't make sense to ask. And sadly, this is question number 2, but I get why it's asked. Anyone who's taken a basic finance course goes through it. It's literally one of the first ways taught on how to calculate the net present value of investments, plugging in what's that dividend or payment back to you and projected growth and discount rate. So it's straightforward. I get it. Now, third, I don't mind as a question, what's the 10-year target revenue and profit margins? I probably wouldn't phrase it that way. So this question is basically getting at what is the long-term perspective from management? We know in the OG days, they were touting 30% growth, $5 billion in revenue. And this is before we saw 2022 and the downturn of growth. So it has since disappeared, but there are clearly records of them doing this and touting it back in the day with those predictions for long-term growth. Now, no one has seen that since and said it would be every single year, of course, since it wasn't estimated growth over a long period of time. But I think if management is willing, I'd want at least some forecasts, even if no specific numbers, what they think. Are we looking at constant growth in the 30s? Do they see accelerating growth going even higher, or at least a possibility of it having an increased growth rate higher than 30%? And do they expect any need to eat into margins maybe if they will fuel top line growth? Things I think all of us are curious about, although I think they might stray from too much specificity given the history. Now, fourth, would any other government apart from the US become your clients for defense contracts? Now, I don't like this question at all because I'd say it's pretty common knowledge and a simple Google search away to see what Palantir has worked with when it comes to other governments, not just administratively, but also defense-wise. This is one of the reasons I believe there is an influx of new people, which is still good, but I hope this kind of question does not draw attention away from the other ones, considering this is highly voted. First, there is international government revenue, but breaking that into defense specifically isn't necessarily obvious on earnings. But we've seen lots of headlines with the UK Military Defense Ministry, which is an easier one, of course, too, as their second biggest customer or country outside the US. But they've gotten smaller ones, say in Australia, that pops up once in a while. So it only takes a simple Google search. They will obviously only work with allies of the United States. Now, skipping the fifth, which repeated that dividend question, we get a question about DOGE helping cost cutting, but isn't that the exact description for what Palantir can be used for? Are you trying to work with Elon and the DOGE department? Now, I think this is a decent question where we can find out from management their perspective, at least, and thoughts on DOGE. Now, anyone media trained, they'll spin it as a positive, most likely touting Palantir's history of removing redundancy while maintaining and increasing security for the US government when they serve them. So if we do hear anything, I'd bet it'd be something general about working with them and showcasing what Palantir has already done historically with the US government. But if we do get something specific around DOGE, like we've already started working together, that's a huge positive if that comes up. Worst case scenario, though, for this question is that they would admit being in the firing line since technically they are paid by the US government and might be seen as an unnecessary cost, although I'd be very curious on the arguments why, and I don't think they would even say that themselves. Now, seventh question, what's the target for this year? I don't even know what this question is. Either way, they'll give their full year 2025 guidance, so not sure why this was even voted 454 times as a top question. Now, eighth question, a bit more interesting and something retail is always curious about, where I'll share my two thoughts. There has been speculation about Palantir offering consumer-facing products, even rumors about a new smartphone platform. Are there plans for a consumer product or smartphone? Now, remember, this is just my opinion. I don't think Palantir wants to get into the business of hardware. We've seen it pretty limited with their SkyKit, although it hasn't been touted much either recently. I'd say mostly the hardware is partnered out where Palantir's software is the main value add from them. Now, with a smartphone running with, say, Palantir, with even the hardware at least under their control and specificity when contracting out, has a very interesting defense and security use case. But breaking the norms and familiarity with the big phone makers already could be a large barrier not worth taking. Plus, they need to get it right if they're breaking into something pretty established like phones, but I'd say the likeliness is still low, and if true, it's farther away and not the main priority. They are a software business and excel greatly, so they definitely double down where they're working, but it's not out of this world, of course, for them to try something new, although how deep into hardware and the side that they go, I don't know. Now, second, in general too, Palantir can already be consumer facing in an indirect way. They've literally go for their AIP for developers where people can just build what they want and then get into the consumer market that way. So in a big way, Palantir's version of being in the consumer market is still serving those who are building for it. So it's still enterprise technically, but big and small, but they are that much closer to the typical consumer. But you never know, I guess, and they may see a growth opportunity around the competition. I don't know. Ninth, and another interesting question to me personally, there are still many companies that haven't heard of Palantir, considering the lack of robust sales team or other marketing related efforts. Is there going to be any focus in 2025 to increase brand awareness to a broader commercial audience? I'm actually curious about this myself, and it's important to note though first, just because us everyday consumers don't see brand awareness efforts besides the typical social media, AFP account events, or Army Navy games or whatever, it doesn't mean they aren't pushing on this front. We know boot camps still are happening and Palantir is getting the product into the hands of new and existing customers alike. This may just be a byproduct of who they're focusing on their efforts on, and that's why we're not seeing it, because it's mostly at enterprises and companies. And we know indirectly continuing to nurture the workforce to use Palantir's products means there will be more exposure over time, albeit slower, than maybe intentional marketing efforts at the enterprise. So I'd be curious to see if management addresses this specifically on those efforts, and if we hear something new, or maybe their bootcamp numbers just explode versus previous times. Then 10th, I think piques some curiosity as well. How does Palantir plan to scale support operations to accommodate the potential increase of government contracts? First, if they were to say there is an increase in government contracts for sure, it'd pretty much have to show in the numbers, or they'll be spilling some nice insider info about upcoming wins. But let's say they do. I think Palantir would answer pretty generically around their scalable software and fantastic employees, So I don't think they'd get into specifics considering the first part I just referred to, but if they do, it'd be cool for that admission. Then the 11th question I don't like, under what conditions would Palantir perform a stock split? This literally doesn't matter at all besides optics. You're just making the stock appear cheaper, but then there'll be more shares out there, so it's the same market cap. So nothing changes, plus you can get fractional shares today, whereas the old days, this is probably a bit more relevant if you wanted to buy shares in Berkshire. And they even just made a separate class for those folks anyways at a smaller price. So thumbs down on this question here, but it would be interesting when they do it, but I don't think it's really worth putting attention towards. And the final question that I'm interested in knowing their way, plus it took getting to question number 12 funnily to make it here, would like to hear your thoughts on how Palantir might be impacted if major government contracts are reevaluated as part of upcoming cost-cutting initiatives. So in reality, they'd probably take the media-trained approach about noting how they'll work together with the US government in meeting their needs and providing value, but at the cost that works for them. And if there are reevaluations, Palantir will do everything they can to recompete and win that business, and probably make a reference to being software scalable and having the flexibility around margins that legacy prime contractors may not have. So I don't expect a real answer here, but I think this flies back into strengthening their argument heard earlier in question 6. But on the flip side, they got to double down on cost cutting, even if they are a premium product where have to spend a bit more. The amount that you're shedding by putting the right infrastructure in place puts the customer, commercial or government, in a better place moving forward because of that infrastructure below. It's scalable and secure and flexible enough for users to take on future use cases that they're still figuring out today and have yet to build. So if you haven't noticed, I'm very curious to know personally how they'll spend their cost cutting to the government, where even if spending goes down, Palantir can still be a winner and soak in more dollars because that's what they're actually providing. But who knows? These are just my opinions on the top questions. What are your thoughts below? And I'll see you in the next video.